extraordinarily interesting if we allow it to be. If we give it some thought. If we give it some thought. And don't let it just pass us by. Don't just let it be whether we're watching Channel 7 or Foxtel. If we give it thought and we give ourselves to it, that's what the adventure of life is. So when we hear something freshly, we're hearing it because this is the moment to hear it. And this is the wake-up call that we need in this moment. And we can't always judge what that wake-up call is going to be, or whether it was quite on our menu. So, the 3 questions that the Buddha asked his monks when they returned from teaching the Gospel of Awakeness. So they would have to go around India, dusty roads, begging for food, being given food some days, perhaps less food other days. Teaching awakeness, and also teaching that what you are coming awake to is, within that context, or it came to be called Buddha nature, which we might call spirit, or we might call soul. Buddha nature, the nature that is universal to us all. In Quaker life, and I had a very long period of my life when Quaker life was very formative for me, we would call it that of God within. That's a beautiful way to call it too, that of God within. And of course, that is a mirror of how the Hindus would see the divine. Absolutely within. But again, within doesn't necessarily, I'm going to get to the 3 questions, but within doesn't necessarily mean in the temple of the heart in here. Within could mean we are within. So don't think of it too geographically. Even if you're a very accomplished 3-dimensional thinker. So the 3 questions. The monks return, dusty, tired, but can you imagine how delighted they would have been to come back and spend a little bit of time, maybe a little bit of time like being on retreat with the Buddha. Can you, who wasn't called the Buddha then, can you imagine what it was like to be in the presence of such kindness? This is what you also have the opportunity to experience on retreat yourselves. To be in the physical presence of kindness. And this is what I want you also to be able to take home, that your knowledge of kindness will be greater, deeper, more trustworthy. So our monks arrive, and perhaps after giving them something to eat and a glass of water and making them comfortable, the Buddha asks, "Are you well?" Now, what does well mean here? I'd like to really ask each of you, and I'd like you to ask yourself, am I well? Are you well? You see, from a spiritual perspective, you can become increasingly well to your very last breath, you can grow in what it means to be well, even when the body becomes very fragile. Because in this context, I think, I've no evidence of this except my own experience, which I'm trusting here, that what it means to be well is only partly conditioned by the physical body. On the other hand, I think this question also invites us to a certain responsibility about the physical body. There are things that we know we can do that help the body, and things we know that we can do that don't help the body. We can love our bodies more. Our love can be manifested also in how we treat our bodies, whether we go for a walk, whether we dance, whether we sing, whether we take joy in living, whether we eat wisely and well, whether we don't push ourselves beyond endurance by what we call external needs, but actually are our internal needs for a certain kind of gratification. We often lose touch with our body wisdom because we are so detached from our physical existence, and yet at the same time so caught up in it. So, for example, often we don't know when we're tired. I could certainly say this is my own experience. Often I haven't recognized that I'm tired. Sometimes my body has had to get ill to tell me how tired I am. Equally, we can treat our bodies like a too fragile thing and lose touch with our robustness and our incredible capacities to recover. But are you well also, I think, really reflects how you are in your heart, how you are in your mind, how you are in your soul. And you have an opportunity here on retreat, and you could make an opportunity for yourselves every day going forward to really ask, what do I need in order to be well? That is a very loving question to ask yourself. Sometimes it's companionship. Sometimes it's some silence, but sometimes it's simply rest and a cup of tea. The second of the Buddha's 3 questions is just as grounded. And that's what I love about these 3 questions. It's just as grounded. It's not an abstraction. The second of the questions was, do you have enough to eat? Now, again, you are feeding your bodies. And it's not just quantity we're talking about here. It's also what you're choosing to feed your body with. But even more for me, this question is about how are you feeding your mind? How are you feeding your mind? Do you have enough to eat? Your mind, your brain even, just the physical brain, never mind your greater mind, just your physical brain is a thing of such wonder. And in the last 10 years, I think I've been teaching sort of along these lines, for at least 25 years, maybe 30. And just in the last 10 years, so much has been learned about the brain, and particularly about its qualities of regeneration. It's very, very exciting. And President Obama has just called for a 10-year huge project on the brain. I could wish with all my heart that he had devoted the same resources to peacemaking. Yeah. I mean, we would live in a completely different world if people really recognized that we could make peace, we could resolve conflict without violence. Or maybe not even resolve it, live with difference without violence. This is what the mind is capable of achieving, but for the moment it's the material, physical brain that is attracting the majority of attention. And even this is very, very interesting, because you are not just a product of your past thoughts. I want to really emphasize that to you. You are highly conditioned by all the experiences that you've had and the ways in which you have thought about them. But you are not doomed or limited or even liberated by what you've learned thus far. You can bring a new mind. Oops. You can bring a new mind to your new day. Your new mind is polished, is tempered, is humbled, is lit up, illuminated, enlightened by all the experiences you've had thus far. But it is still emerging. You are an emerging mind. Isn't that a glorious thing to remember? That you are an emerging mind. You're not stuck. In fact, you can't be stuck. You're either regressing or progressing. Not possible just to stay in the same place. It's not possible in our human condition just to stay in the same place. You are emerging. You are evolving. You are in a constant state of evolution. And the real challenge of this time, of our time, is that we recognize that our individual spiritual evolution depends upon one another, because we will raise each other together. This is meta-democracy. That we will rise and evolve together. That when we evolve by one tiny thought, we evolve not for ourselves alone, but for all. When we offer a moment's kindness to another human being, we are making a kinder world, moment by moment by moment. We are all contributing to our spiritual evolution. I think that's a very, very grown-up thing to recognize. Yes, look through the eyes of a child and see the wonder of this world, but then take responsibility for who and what you are becoming. And crucial to this, fundamental to this, is what you are feeding your mind with. Whether you are lifting your thoughts, whether you are reflecting on something with hope. You know, I've been writing full-time for 30 years, I think, this year. It's 30 years in May. This is May. It's 30 years this month, but at the end of the month, since I came to live in Australia. And I've lived in Australia longer than I've lived anywhere. And through that time, writing has been my main work. And through all this time, my work has been in different ways, in different books, using different subjects, but always this same thing. Recognizing our potential to live more lovingly, and therefore to live more peacefully, and therefore to live more safely, and therefore to live much more happily. So I couldn't have known at the beginning of that time that this was my work in this way. I couldn't possibly have known. It emerges moment by moment. You know, you take one step in the dark, and then you take another step, and then there's a little period of light, and then you take another step in the dark. But the privilege of feeding my mind with those teachings that allowed me to write the books, and feeding my mind with the preparations that I would be doing for a service, or being with you here today, or whatever part of the work is, I'm just, if I think about that, I'm just dazzled by how fortunate that is. And you are all equally fortunate. You can all also feed your minds with good company, and it doesn't mean just being bouncy, bouncy, bouncy all the time. Of course not. What I'm talking about is not just positive thinking. No. I'm also thinking about, for example, and I've written so much about this, how do you face the times that are terrifying? How do you feed your heart and soul when you feel hopeless? It's not just about sunny side up, because that would be untrue. Life isn't just about sunny side up. But it is possibly about recognizing that the sun does rise again. That the renewal of hope is a uniquely human capacity, and that it rises most authentically when it arises from a stubborn love of life, even when life has not delivered itself to you satisfactorily, even perhaps when life has deprived you of what you most wanted. So, do you have enough to eat is a profound question when it is asked within a spiritual context. You know, when I prepare the services that we have at Pitt Street every month, and many of you have been, and some of you come very regularly, I prepare those services, the liturgies and the teachings that the services offer. I prepare them with my mind, and, you know, I like doing research and thinking and writing because that's my work. But I also prepare them with my heart. Without knowing who will be there, I nevertheless do my best to prepare that the themes will meet at least some of the people present, where they are and what they're needing. And even, oddly, that ministry that I'm able to do through Facebook, each day I pray and then I post a little teaching, very short, because that's the nature of posting on Facebook. And I have fun finding an image and I put it there, and surprisingly often someone will say, yes, that's what I needed. And it's not that I can read your minds, it's that the longings in our hearts are very similar. We're travelling very similar journeys, even if the particularities are rather different. The third of the Buddha's questions is even more challenging and even more loving. Are you living in harmony with one another? Well, of course, the first question really to ask ourselves is, are we living in harmony with ourselves? And we won't always be living in harmony with ourselves. Our lives are very accurately represented through music. And if you listen to a lot of music, and I hope you do, I think it's one of the most delightful spiritual practices to listen to music. If you listen to music, you will hear there are sometimes discords as well as harmonies. And sometimes a note is left and then resolved. And actually, I would urge you, if you're having a very hard time, that you sometimes just sit and surrender yourself to a piece of music that is a divine expression. I think there are some pieces of music that are really expressions of the divine. And you will know them when you hear them. So, our efforts to live in harmony with one another will succeed. Our efforts to live in harmony with one another